Well, this is a nice short break from making in-depth response videos or essays. I don't know if I'd say I'm quite feeling it yet, but I should be done with my burnout pretty soon here.
I saw in my suggestion a rebuttal to that video from my least favorite furry Ancap YouTuber, Esoteric Entity. So I watched it and it was really bad, and this video is responding to that video.
God fucking damn it. So, in February of 2018, wow, seriously, it was almost 2 years ago? Anyway, I uploaded a response video to a presentation created by a self-proclaimed Marxian economist and computer scientist named Paul Cockshott, in which he attempted to explain the labor theory of value and its proposed basis in scientific observation, which mostly consisted of misunderstanding, or more than likely deliberately misrepresenting, criticisms of the labor theory of value, particularly views which reject attempts to empirically analyze market trends and the field of economics as a science. His video was entitled "Why the Labor Theory of Value is Right," and because my video was a counter to his, I entitled mine "Why the Labor Theory of Value is Wrong." So the reason that I bring this up is because, oh lord, the amount of salt that video mined from butthurt Marxists was a sight to behold, to put it simply. If you think that Chomsky's cult of personality with post-Marxists is bad, make a video response to anything put out by Paul Cockshott and watch how Marx-Leninists respond to you, doubting the excellence of their Führer. Anyway, Reddit and Marxist Twitter raids, on that video aside, something which I will admit is that it wasn't intended to be a complete and cohesive rebuttal to the labor theory of value, just a response to the arguments which Paul Cockshott specifically proposed in that video. And I probably could have gone into greater detail even regarding those points which I was responding to. So to be completely fair, I probably could have made my response to Cockshott with more detail than I did, and if your expectation going into that video based on the title was for it to be a cohesive rebuttal to the labor theory of value, then sure, it's probably a bit underwhelming to say the least. Recently, a response video to my response video to Paul Cockshott was created by some dead-eyed first-year liberal arts college student who goes by the moniker of Mouthy Infidel. And before I even got into the arguments presented in this video, everything about the presentation and the demeanor of Mouthy Infidel is so insufferably smug and sure of himself, from the title of the video describing this as a debunking, implying that Mouthy Infidel believes there is no possible way to even conceptualize a counter-argument to what he's about to present, to his mannerisms of, I'm gonna debunk your theories and prove myself to be the master debater. I knew just from that alone that the arguments he presented were going to be abhorrent and that I was going to need to do a response video, and sure enough, it turns out I was right. And because there's nothing more satisfying than taking Dunning-Kruger's down a few pegs, this seemed like a perfect way to get back into the swing of writing essays and response videos while also following up on an older video which frankly could use a little bit of work.
Okay, so a little while ago, Marxian economist and computer scientist Paul Cockshott made this video titled "Why the Labor Theory of Value is Right." The video in pretty simple terms explained the labor theory of value, went over and debunked some of the most common attacks against it, such as the subjective theory of value and the transformation problem, and then provided a plethora of empirical evidence supporting the labor theory of value.
Now I'm gonna go ahead and get this out of the way right now, because if I don't, the comments will likely be flooded with the butthurt Marxist trolls who came to dislike this video after Democratic Socialist 01 or some other dirtbag leftist that has a history of using their audience to manipulate ratings of content they don't like, spamming about it. The original video here is 51 minutes long, and most of it consists either of the creator spending ungodly amounts of time bloviating or taking way too long to get to the fucking point. So I'm going to be editing this down quite a bit to keep only the relevant pieces of information. I will, however, be linking the original upload as a pinned comment so that you can check whether or not I left something out or if I'm accused of strawmanning them. But even with that very short clip, we've already arrived at the first and main problem here.
And then provided a plethora of empirical evidence supporting the labor theory of value.
How do you use an empirical formula itself to prove anything in relation to economic theory? Or what motivates market actors specifically to engage in trade within an empiricist framework? Now, that's not to say that writing down an argument as a formula can't be helpful in simplifying information, or that there isn't a purpose to writing down arguments with empirical data, since the most famous textbooks, even utilizing the Austrian methodology, such as Human Action by Ludwig von Mises, feature formulations of economic arguments. But empirical data itself can only have meaning as a representation of a line of a priori reasoning. A great example of this would be the chart which is quite often thrown around by Austro-libertarians, Marxists, and/or so-called progressives, showing the disparity between GDP and wages. Despite this being the exact same statistic in every case, the argument presented by the people, depending on their stated affiliation or lack thereof, varies for what this figure represents in meaning. Austro-libertarians and Marxists both attribute this disparity to a boom-bust cycle, but differ in their proposed explanation of how this business cycle manifests. Marxists argue that it is the result of a rate of profit which declines naturally due to the increased productivity, while Austro-libertarians argue firstly that GDP isn't an accurate measure of economic growth because it doesn't account for double spending, e.g. a business which gives out gift cards registering both the purchase of the gift card and the purchase of goods made with the registered credit on the gift card, which firms are, by the way, incentivized to do because of the stock market and finance laws, and includes government spending, which operates outside of market signals. Secondly, that stagnation and various forms of declining in wealth are a product of false market signals being created due to speculative mismanagement by finance manipulation incentivized by government-enforced legislative fiat, particularly regarding interest rates and loaning practices as defined by central banks and, in the case of the US government, the FDIC. Now, Keynesians argue that it's because too many people save too much of their money, but that's a whole nother video in and of itself for a different day. The point is, though, that empirical data in and of itself, even in conception, cannot be the basis for observing scientific truths of any variety, let alone on the economic front. Because even if you were to get past the fact that to merely assert that scientific truths can only be based on empirical sensory experience is to engage in a performative contradiction which actively disproves the argument which you'd be attempting to establish from even within your own conceptual framework. The main problem with the empiricist, materialistic argumentative framework is that you can't construct any cohesive truth claim behind any sensory observation you provide or information which is presented, because how people interpret information and sensory data itself is entirely relative and will be evaluated by each person differently based on their own internal worldviews. Within the Marxist argumentative framework, for example, there's no way to refute any particular claims made about any other economic theory, except to merely point to something Marx wrote himself if Marx happened to have written something which contradicts the presented claim. Hence why, if you've ever debated with a Marxist on any subject where your disagreement stems from a conceptual premise which differs from their own, it doesn't take very long to get a pretty strong religious culty vibe from their arguments, because like most of the ardent forms of religiosity, the narrative construction of Marxism and all other empiricist methodologies are entirely and necessarily tautological. Arguments proposed within these worldviews as a substitute for any tangible truth claim will instead rhetorically structure their arguments in a way in which their conclusion is either implied in the premise as opposed to using reasoning to support their arguments because, well, their own premise is based on the idea that only empirical data can serve as the basis of truth, and anything otherwise would contradict the idea of economics as a science, let alone the notion that central planning is feasible. Or will try arbitrarily to claim without any consistent ability to do so that no other means would be valid in terms of analyzing the information which they present relating to a specific subject. As a result, their arguments within their own framework rhetorically can't be falsified. Their arguments therefore have no ability to substantially refute any conflicting claims, which means consequently claims made and argued within these rhetorical structures can't be used to demonstrate anything. Now, is this to say that presupposition itself is a problem? Not at all. In fact, in order to have any sort of discussion, framing, that means including information and excluding information deemed relevant or helpful by the propagator of said argument, is necessary to convey any arguments or claims with even the appearance of cohesion to begin with, because within an event or subject there exists a practically infinite amount of data which one could present, and to convey information out of these bits and pieces of data requires internal framing to some extent, both on the part of the person conveying information, but the audience which is internalizing it as well. Meaning that if there isn't an underlying narrative within the methodology in question which can be mutually understood by the propagators and receivers of information, that being a supporting piece of a priori reasoning presumed in the conceptual framework of how information which is presented within arguments relating to a specific theory or scientific methodology, which have the ability to be tested for whether or not they have any validity or can be debunked using some other observable factor, then such a position has no ability to construct an objective truth claim, because there's no concrete, universally understood information being conveyed through arguments in support of such a claim or methodology. Take the cited, quote, empirical evidence provided by Mouthy Infidel.
Studies examining the labor theory of value began to arise in the 80s and even initially showed very positive results. Some of the most notable included Scheick's paper in 1984, Petrovic's paper in 1987, and Ochoa's paper in 1989, all of which examined the correlation between labor and prices with input-output charts for different times and economies and so on, all of which offered results which strongly vindicated the labor theory of value.
Well, first of all, conceptual issues with merely using empirical data as substance to prove any argument regarding the nature of commodity value aside, which I'll be going over in a moment, input-output charts don't account for substitution, have no internal mechanism to account for price adjustments, doesn't allow for joint production, and there are numerous instances throughout history as well where increasing input doesn't correspond with an increase in output factors, an example of which being the 1947 automobile industry in the United States' I/O table that year. And if that wasn't enough to convince you of the conceptual issues with I/O tables, the data which is used to make up every year's I/O table is made measuring entirely different aspects of the political economy, different industries, different and entirely arbitrary collections of firms within said industries, etc. And there's no rhyme or reason behind choosing the industries to measure in each different I/O table other than the so-called economists creating these I/O tables' relative interpretation of which of the industries they're using as reference to be relevant to the argument which they're attempting to convey. So as a reference for economic productivity or wealth creation, I/O tables are even less reliable than GDP, because at least with GDP, the factors which are taken into consideration when formulating the data aren't entirely arbitrary, and in every single one of the studies, which was cited by Mouthy Infidel here as well, the authors of the said studies use entirely different references in formulating their I/O tables, along with entirely different conceptions for what exactly counts as proof of it being the sole factor in formulating prices, and what standards of measurement are used to demonstrate the arguments the authors are attempting to establish. The scientific proof of the labor theory of value as being argued for by Mouthy Infidel, Paul Cockshott, and the authors of the cited studies therefore consist of using mathematical formulas in an attempt to objectively demonstrate the nature of determined general trends for a field of study which can only conceptually make sense to observe anything within from a behavioral approach using entirely arbitrary units of measurement compared to data where there's no objective and cohesive basis for what counts as a representation for the said dataset until the people in question arrive at multiple numbers which, in context from an entirely arbitrary perspective, can be framed in a manner where there appears to be correlation shown between the presented numbers. To establish proof for an argument which wouldn't even refute the claim they're attempting to refute in the first place, that being the theory of marginal utility in modern supply and demand theory, because no marginalist has ever claimed that market price can't ever closely correlate with the labor input cost for production in a given firm or even an analysis of an entire industry. And there's no internal implications within the marginalist framework which suggests that this is the case. So, in other words, they're just kind of making shit up, aren't they?
So what we can see is that the labor theory of value can be empirically observed and factually vindicated through a variety of different methodologies by a variety of different papers in a variety of different economies in a variety of different time periods. The data regarding the validity of the labor theory of value is incredibly consistently positive.
And as I lightly touched upon a few moments ago, this is the root of the problem for not just the labor theory of value, but the Marxist premise from which their approach to studying market trends lies in the first place. And there seems to be a sort of tone deafness which plagues Marxist arguments against the relevance of marginal utility in formulating market prices, or praxeological human action being the basis for observed market trends rather than generalized input lacking theoretical mathematical formulas. In the case of marginal utility specifically, this conceptual ineptitude largely falls at the feet of two problems. Firstly, the conflation of market price, input cost, and value, which according to Marxists, input cost, or in their case, a single input cost, labor, and value, the individual's internalized utility for a given commodity, are interchangeable. This problem is exacerbated by the fact that Marxism's internal presuppositions define value as an input cost, Because as noted earlier, as a materialist position, Marxism can't construct any cohesive truth claims, so any supporting premises, which in scientific methodologies would be axiomatic positions based on tangible observations which could be challenged or demonstrated to some extent, are defined in Marxism's arguments in a way which are rhetorically intended to be the only positions able to work conceptually with the argument being presented, manipulating people into being forced to come to the desired conclusion if the Marxists' argumentative framework were to be accepted. And secondly, of course, Marxists and empiricists in general view the study of markets purely in aggregates and generalizations, to the point where their analysis becomes blatantly disassociated from lived reality simply to justify their core premises, such as the Marxist class theory, which asserts that incentives which human action is based upon are conceived of as people operating as parts of multiple homogeneous bodies which make up society that have no individuality and have a prescriptive interest defined by purely their descriptive character traits. So therefore, this is ultimately a question of conflicting premises which make up the foundation of the arguments for how information relating to this field of study is conceptualized rather than the information itself, and to discuss the information itself is not that helpful. And the fact that mouthy infidel Paul Cockshott, along with most other Marxists' response to arguments which assert marginal utility as the basis for value is, well, Marx said that labor value is the base of market price, and here's some empirical data which doesn't even have a consistent definition of the categories these multiple studies are examining or even the metrics they're referencing. Also, technology is better now, so the economic calculation problem is irrelevant, cause we have more processing power, so we can calculate formulas much quicker. It just shows that they really don't understand the position they're arguing against. And this is because market signals are the product of people associating in pursuit of their own internalized interests relative to their perception of conditions in the society around them. Therefore, market trends are a behavioral science, and the way to make observation in this field of study is to start from the premise of trying to deduce logically what would cause people to utilize their resources in a way which could create an observed trend in the economy, rather than treating the economy as if it's somehow separate from the human actors whose interactions create the market signals being observed. Now, the closest thing to a response which Marxists have ever given to this is, rather hilariously, to try and claim that this framework is tautological, as Cockshott did in the original video. So I will give Marxists who've claimed this the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're arguing in good faith when they attempt to establish this point through their argumentation, though it's very easy to argue otherwise. Mainly because it's easier to structure a more substantive rebuttal assuming that this is the case. The fundamental base which their argument is structured upon is the premise that non-sensory experience, or anything which isn't formulated empirical data, can't be scientific because it has no objective basis to be demonstrated from, because every person develops their own relative conception of information, which means it has no explanatory power, which... yeah, those are pretty much just the problems with materialism or empiricism projected onto rationalism and the Austrian methodology. Now you know why I have to preface that I'm framing my rebuttal to this as if Marxists are approaching in good faith, rather than it just being a given, because it really doesn't seem like they are. Anyway, well, where Marxists go wrong is confusing logical and psychological self-evidence. And when Austrians describe self-evident axioms, Marxists and other empiricists who've proposed this argument presumably internalize what's being proposed as some individual proclaiming their own interpretation of information as being objective, and substantiating this by citing what is proclaimed to be an internal, private, overwhelming feeling, and proclaiming it to be scientifically valid by citing some vague sense of intuition. And whatever the said person is proclaiming could maybe give me roughly an idea of what motivates their thought process and how they perceive the world around them, but of course, if that's what the Austrian methodology was based upon, then it would suffer from the demarcation problem for the same reason as empiricist doctrines. In other words, there would be no cohesion for any information presented other than arbitrary relative interpretation of the information, rhetorically assumed to be true in the premise of the methodological approach in question. But of course, that's a misinterpretation of the premise behind how one establishes scientific truths being put forward by Austrians and rationalists. What these groups argue from is logical self-evidence, which varies from psychological self-evidence in that logically self-evident claims are based upon reasoning which can be demonstrated and proven because there is no logically coherent argument which can be proposed as a null hypothesis. Examples of which would be the law of non-contradiction, that it's impossible for something to both be true and untrue simultaneously, and 2 units of 2 adding up to anything other than 4 units. Internalized perception of reasoning are shaped entirely by what bits of information humans process, which is dependent on a near boundless amount of factors, including but not limited to the source of information, how the information is spun and presented to them through the narrative structures it is, cognitive dissonance, environment, individual preferences, mood, psychological state, chemicals in their system, material and social interests, etc. Whereas logical observations can be demonstrated by anyone, repeatedly, tested, and exist independently of relative human perception. The former category cannot be proposed as an objective argument, and indeed outside of moral absolutist circles within religious communities, no one even attempts to argue from this position. So, what are some logically self-evident points which demonstrate definitively that the study of markets is a behavioral science and excludes the possibility that there can be an intrinsic commodity value? Well, there are a myriad of examples, but I'll go ahead and stick to 3 for the sake of time, as this video's already gotten quite long as is. Firstly, and most obviously, is the fact that demand is relevant to the calculation of prices for commodities on the market for firms to internally manage resources efficiently in the first place. That undermines any arguments for intrinsic value, because if the value of said commodities was determined entirely by input costs or a single input cost, then consumer input would be irrelevant. Now, Marxists have, of course, attempted to retcon their description of the labor theory of value in multiple ways over the last 150 years when faced with an overwhelming deal of evidence that claims Marx made or another Marxist philosopher had proposed, which were widely accepted by their community regarding the labor theory of value, were proven to be wrong so profoundly that the positions in question, even within the Marxist framework, had a difficult time being conceptually justified after that point, which had blatantly contradicted the Marxist argument, or a conflicting position had been demonstrated to be valid which conceptually invalidates the labor theory of value, had become widely accepted because it answered gray areas pre-marginalist economists had recognized but had no means of solving within the study of economics as it had been conceived of prior. Pretty much every fundamental argument made by Marxist economics has experienced this in some way or another, but none more than the labor theory of value. In fact, even in proposing the Marxist variant of the LTV in capital, Marx introduced the aspect of socially necessary labor input in an attempt to try and retroactively negate a common criticism of intrinsic value arguments even for the time, known as the transformation problem. In other words, market prices not being affected by a disproportionately larger or smaller amount of laborers working or capital invested in disproportionately longer or shorter amounts of time, or larger and smaller amounts of input commodities to manufacture specific product relative to other firms. Well, the argument from socially necessary labor input attempted to establish that market price only increases in proportion to the labor as is performed in conformity with some average skill and productivity. Which not only did Marx's attempt to explain away the transformation problem with his proposition of socially necessary labor input refute none of the problems intrinsic value arguments have, because mainly socially necessary input as Marx conceptualized it was not a new concept and hasn't ever been denied by any other school of thought or methods. They simply argue that market value is more complicated than this. But this creates even more issues. For instance, how do you equate an hour of data entry with an hour of physical labor? And how are these things quantified? How do you equate or differentiate manual labor in one industry with another, or data entry for that matter? The reason I bring this up here, though, is because the concept of socially necessary labor has also been cited by Marxists as an attempt to establish a continuity between the theories of Marx and supply and demand theory, even by Engels himself. And yes, the cost of labor is indeed a factor in price calculation, but that is only a factor on the supply curve and one of many. Not only are there more factors taken into consideration for just the supply input, but the costs of all of those inputs are also subject to their own market supply and demand curves, and all of the inputs required to produce those inputs as well, and so on. So the value of those inputs individually can fluctuate based on a whole host of factors, innovations on how those inputs are produced, natural disasters, or some other event which creates a scarcity of one or more of those input factors, the law of comparative advantage, where one or more of the input factors require fewer inputs to obtain, or are in greater abundance in terms of distance, or a greater supply in one specific area compared to others, which make them far easier for a firm in a specific area to obtain compared to others, or there being more utility for some of the input factors due to climate, for instance, compared to other areas, which makes them more expensive, and I could go on. But this still does absolutely nothing to explain away the demand curve, which is entirely dependent on consumer interaction and is affected by points not wholly based on input factors relating to producing the commodities in question. In fact, it mostly isn't, and that opens up a whole nother can of worms, because modern supply and demand theory tells us that a leftward moving supply curve, in other words, capital costs increasing, lead us to deduce that market prices will be higher, and also will result in fewer quantities because less consumption is occurring. Something which, if the labor theory of value were correct, would not be true. The last line of defense from Cockshot and others like him who've realized that autistically attempting to have their cake and eat it too isn't going to do them any favors, will resort to, of course, is to try and regress and double down by claiming that supply and demand curves are unfalsifiable, that being their usual counter to modern supply and demand theory. And, Well, no, that's absolute bullshit. It's entirely possible to falsify supply and demand theory. Not only is it possible, it would be incredibly easy to do so. Point to a single example of a downward sloping supply curve or an upward sloping demand curve, and you've completely debunked modern supply and demand theory. So no, it's not unfalsifiable, it's just correct. Secondly, the labor theory of value assumes that all economic models are based on perfect information, and there are numerous issues here alone. There's the fact that production, trade, and consumption all occur at different times, making it impossible for information relevant to economic calculation to be known at the time the decision to produce or buy is made. There's the fact that different information can be and is made available exclusively to human actors before others. There's of course the issue mentioned earlier where the information which is interpreted as being relevant to any subject, let alone economic calculation, by each individual person is relative and varies from human actor to human actor. Perfect information would also assume that all relevant information is revealed through simply the existence of the commodity itself, and the list could go on. Point is, it's an invalid structure. And lastly, but not the only other criticism, I went over this in explaining supply and demand curves, so I won't spend too much time here, but once you factor in capital as an input cost, which Marx's economic treatise does not, ironic given that it's literally titled Capital, you get faced immediately with another major problem, which is that by no standard, even assuming that economic value can be set by some inherent standard, is labor value capable of being intrinsically quantified by any meaningful standard, and what determines the input cost of labor will change based on just as many consumer-based variables, if not more, depending on conditions in the said industry, as the general competitive market price for the commodities produced that the labor market for that said industry is meant to represent. Therefore, it really doesn't matter from what starting point you approach your analysis of economic value is, or what your conceptual premise is based on. Capital cost and supply factors consequently are themselves influenced by external factors, which largely are based around consumer input. Welcome to Film Theory. In the episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia entitled Flowers for Charlie, spoiler alert, Charlie Kelly is given a placebo pill which he was told would make him more intelligent, with this constantly being reinforced by a scientist from the university which gave him the medication. But was it really a placebo? Throughout the episode, Charlie had been told by the assistant that he had just proven the existence of the Marxist theory of surplus value.
An astute observation conforms with Marxist theories about the exploitation of the proletariat. It completely conforms when you think about it.
And during the presentation of the conclusion of this experiment revealed at the end of the episode, Charlie Kelly can be seen writing a mathematical formula which is implied by the presenters to be meaningless.
The subject believed himself to be a mathematical wizard.
Plus 9 equals box, all right? That's where the cat goes.
Is it possible that the pills Charlie Kelly received actually did cause him to become a big-brained boy, but they also turned him into a Marxist, and therefore everything he attempted to articulate was perceived by other people to just be incoherent nonsense? We don't know, but that's just a film. Yeah, okay, I'll stop now. So that's the end of this video. I'm planning on making a follow-up on this subject in the following months, where I explain how, despite it being impossible to simply start up a firm alone and arrive at the end conclusions, Marxists argue through the explanation Marxists provide of their economic theory will be the inevitable means of arriving there. It is possible to create social structures through various means which can incentivize human actors organizing within said organizations to evaluate their interests and perceived economic values in a way which are very similar to how Marx described. But I've spent almost 3 weeks writing this video due to a whole host of complicating factors, mainly being that I wasn't wanting to make fucking videos at the moment, but this little shit had to come along and challenge me. So yeah, this is a bit of a rushed ending, as you could probably tell by the perplexing grammatical structures. Mainly, this is just me wanting to finish this fucking thing so I can take a break for a few days and start on the next project. Anyway, moving on to patron questions. For $2 or more a month to this channel's Patreon, and if you join the Discord, you can ask questions in the hidden Patrons Question Discord channel, which have the potential of being answered at the end of any video. From Ujiri, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What's with the Hoppy in Tears mug your avatar has sometimes? I looked into Hoppa a bit, and it sounds like he's an Ancap, at least mostly. Is your disagreement with him just the border thing? I'm with you on that, but it doesn't seem like a big enough issue for him to be the best person to drink the tears of. So, for those of you who don't know, my old avatar drinking a mug with the words Hoppy and Tears written on it is the icon I use for StreamYard, a streaming service which Filthy and I use to host the Cool Capitalist Kids podcast episodes, now which we upload on Filthy Heretics' YouTube channel. Well, firstly, while the border and immigration positions of Hans Hermann Hoppe are major points of contention, my issue with Hoppe is more of what he conceptualizes an anarchist society to be, his ethical conclusions, his conception of the motivating factors behind human action, and his political messaging. But at some point, presumably pretty soon here, given that many people seem to be up in arms over some of my recent offhand comments in my Discord server about Hoppe and some of Hoppe's positions, which Hoplu has been ranting about on Twitter, I'll probably make an essay going over my problems with Hoppe in greater detail. The Hoppy and Tears mug, though, was intended to be a dig at what I perceive to be the rather snowflakey way in which Hoppians, that being followers of Hoppe, in my personal experience have reacted to criticism of Hoppe's ideas and not necessarily Hoppe himself. For example, they absolutely refuse to stick with a cohesive praxis. No matter what they say, no matter how they've said it, and no matter what Hoppe said, if you attempt to get them to establish a coherent picture of what they want, the implications of it, and how a community covenant should be organized along with how it can be organized ethically, and some of the problems that presents, they'll immediately start backtracking and trying to redefine words, or claim you just have never read Hans Hermann Hoppe, even if you cite an exact page number and title of one of his works. And of course, they almost all start trying to claim you don't understand Austro-libertarianism in general, and are some sort of crypto-communist. I just find them to be very tedious and annoying. Anyway, thank you for asking, and I will see you all next